I think my birthdays taught me more about life than any other single experience. In our family, birthdays were big occasions, balloons, cakes, even a well-crafted celebration schedule pinned to the fridge weeks in advance. I should say, though, the grandness didn't extend evenly to everyone. For my siblings, the celebrations always meant a luxurious gift, something glamorous and pricey, as if my parents saw an potential deserving of investment. And for me, birthdays brought something a little different. My siblings would unwrap a box of glittering possibilities, a tablet for my sister, a designer purse for my brother, and while they peeled off ribbon after ribbon, I could almost feel the tension in the room whenever I opened my own present. It was hard not to feel the weight of judgment, even though it was quiet. By the time my hands landed on the small, neatly wrapped package that would inevitably contain something like a set of body wash, I'd perfected my smile, wide and enthusiastic. Body wash. Sometimes it was a cheap watch. Other years, a journal or a set of kitchen towels. Useful things, practical things. My parents would pat my shoulder or offer a week, "I thought you might need this." And, in a way, they were right. I did use the gifts. That was the thing, though I was never looking for utility. I wanted recognition, a sign that maybe, just maybe, they saw me as someone worthy of luxury, as someone special. This year was the year I'd finally gotten the courage to think about things differently. I'd been setting aside a little money, saving here and there, for what felt like an eternity. And this year, on the night of my birthday, I sat in bed scrolling through listings for small apartments in nearby towns. I knew I wasn't moving out, by society's standards. I wasn't buying a house or renting some dream loft in the city. But I was moving away from the invisible labels, from the subtle hints that I was only deserving of something ordinary. For years, I'd convinced myself that staying at home while working and saving was the practical thing to do. But, lately, I'd realized that if I stayed, I might end up as part of the furniture, something functional and unremarkable. The plan was simple: find a place, pack my things, and leave as quietly as possible. But as I started packing, I couldn't help feeling the sting of my family's indifference. I mentioned the move in passing, giving them plenty of time to ask questions or give me some kind of send-off. But their reactions were minimal. Maybe a quick nod or an, "Oh, okay, well that's good." No big discussions, no curiosity about my plans, my job, or even my safety. To them, my decision seemed as mundane as the gifts I'd received year after year. In a way, this reaction validated my decision even more. It hurt, but it also proved what I'd always suspected, that, to my family, I'd been the reliable, practical one, the one they didn't have to worry about or make grand gestures for. I wasn't reckless or prone to big, risky dreams, like my brother, or outwardly ambitious, like my sister, and for that, I think they'd unconsciously chosen to look right past me. I spent days sorting through my belongings. Most of what I owned could fit in a few boxes. I'd never been one to accumulate too many things. The gifts I'd received over the years, all practical and necessary, found their way into the boxes with ease, each one a reminder of how small I'd felt. Quietly folding up parts of myself to make room for everyone else's personalities. There was a box of journals I'd kept from childhood, one in particular that made me pause. Flipping through its pages, I found entries I'd written as a kid, each page an exploration of dreams and wild ideas. There was one dream I'd had repeatedly, one I'd actually written down, a simple fantasy where, instead of turning up to find yet another useful gift on my birthday, I'd come home to a room of sparkling decorations, a grand present waiting for me, maybe a trip, or something extravagant, something that felt like a celebration of me, just for me. I'd written out this vision in painstaking detail, down to the colors of the ribbons. Reading it now, I felt both foolish and strangely comforted. Somewhere inside me, that kid still hoped, and maybe, I realized, this move was my way of finally giving that girl what she'd always wanted: a fresh start. Unburdened by expectations or quiet dismissals. The day I moved out, I half expected someone in my family to realize the gravity of it, to come out to the car as I packed up and ask me to stay, or, at the very least, to offer a hug. But my departure was as quiet as everything else had been. They waved from the porch, my mom vaguely smiling, my dad with his arms crossed, and my siblings barely looking up from their phones. I didn't even feel angry, it just made sense. As I drove off, I felt a strange kind of freedom, one I hadn't felt before. I hadn't made a grand escape, no dramatic exit, but something about that silence felt like a form of closure. For once, I was heading somewhere new, where I didn't have to be the practical one, where I could just be me. Settling into the apartment wasn't easy. The place was bare and quiet, the walls an indifferent beige. I didn't have the money or energy for decor, So I kept things minimal. My few belongings lined up in neat rows. Every evening, I'd look at the empty walls and feel the weight of my decision press down on me. This was what I'd wanted. Right, to be free, to be alone, to create my own space. But that freedom came with something else, solitude. And with it, silence. In the quiet, the memories of my family felt sharper, as if their voices echoed louder in my mind now than they ever had at home. I started questioning whether this independence was what I'd really wanted or just an idea I'd clung to because it felt like the only way to matter. The loneliness was unexpected, and in those first few weeks, it took everything I had to push through. I reminded myself that change was never easy, that I'd chosen this path for a reason, and that maybe, just maybe, this solitude was exactly what I needed to grow. After I'd settled in my new apartment, I could still feel the shadow of home hovering around me, like an invisible shroud I'd accidentally brought along. As the days passed, I spent hours unpacking slowly, carefully, thinking about each item in my boxes. Each thing I took out brought a new wave of memories, moments I hadn't revisited in years. I unpacked my journals first. These had been my lifeline, my safe space. I'd scribbled in them every time I felt something I didn't want to share with anyone else. My dreams, my worries, and my resentments all lived there in the pages. Flipping through them, I could trace the years through my handwriting, alone, bold in some places, delicate in others, sometimes harsh, other times soft. I read about the first time I noticed the gift differences, about how I had convinced myself it was just my turn for something smaller. Back then, I'd written down a list of reasons why I didn't need nice things. I was practical, I was sensible, I didn't need extravagance. I'd convinced myself that it was better this way. But here, in this quiet apartment, with no one watching, I let myself feel the hurt I'd buried. My journal entries were raw, honest proof that I had never been indifferent to the treatment I'd received. Even when I'd pretended to be, each memory felt like a needle in my heart. But I kept reading, kept remembering, as if by doing so, I could finally free myself from it. I'd packed a few family photos too, not out of sentiment but more as a record. In the pictures, my family looked so put together, so happy and perfect. Mom and Dad with their proud, fixed smiles, my siblings with their flashy clothes and confident postures. And me, somewhere off to the side, smiling but always a little out of place, as if even the camera had picked up on the subtle imbalance in our relationships. With each picture, I found myself reflecting on the way I'd forced myself to fit into that dynamic. I had done everything I could to avoid making waves, to be the reliable one, the one they didn't have to worry about. And maybe that's why they'd never given me anything extraordinary. I hadn't asked for anything, hadn't demanded their attention the way my siblings had. I'd been so scared of being seen as needy or difficult that I'd given up the right to be seen at all. But it was different now. Here, in this quiet, nondescript apartment, I was alone with the ghosts of my past, finally allowing myself to let them settle instead of chasing them away. I'd spent so many years running from the pain, but now, I saw it was time to face it head on, to accept that I had been hurt, that I had felt unloved and unseen. Then there were the practical gifts, a set of hand towels, a cheap watch with a cracked face, a hairbrush. I laid each item out on my bed, realizing they were like artifacts from a life I'd lived according to others' expectations. Each one reminded me of a birthday where I'd gone through the motions, smiling and thanking everyone, telling myself I was grateful. But these things, they weren't treasures. They weren't markers of love. They were just things, chosen because they were easy, safe, unremarkable. For the first time, I allowed myself to see my family through a different lens. Perhaps they treated me this way because they saw me as a solution, not a person, a quiet, dependable presence, someone who never asked too much, who filled the spaces and did what was needed without ever needing anything in return. And so, they'd given me things that matched that image, gifts that served a purpose but never acknowledged me for who I truly was. I started thinking back to my siblings, to the luxury gifts they'd received year after year, to the money and time and thought that had gone into making them feel special. And though I felt a stab of resentment, there was something else there too, a realization that I had a choice. I could keep letting their treatment define me, or I could start seeing myself as someone worthy, someone who deserved more. That night, after unpacking, I sat on the bare floor of my new apartment with my back against the wall, staring at my half-empty boxes. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle around me. I told myself, for the first time, that I could build something different here. I didn't have to be the practical one, the reliable one. I could be whatever I wanted, whoever I wanted. This space was mine alone. And so, I made a promise to myself. Right there in the dim light of my new life, I would treat myself with the kindness I'd been searching for in others. I would give myself the things I'd always hoped someone else would give me: understanding, care, love. I would create the life I'd dreamed of, not because I needed to prove anyone wrong, but because I was worth it. As I lay on my bed that night, the silence of the apartment felt different. It wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I didn't have a family who saw me the way I wanted to be seen, but I had me, and maybe that was enough. Freedom, I discovered, isn't always as glamorous as it sounds. In my first few weeks alone, I was quickly introduced to its less romantic aspects: the leaking faucet I couldn't fix, the single overhead light that cast harsh shadows across my tiny living room, the low hum of the refrigerator that seemed amplified in the silence. I realized how different it was to be truly, completely alone. I'd always thought I was someone who thrived in solitude, but that solitude took on a new weight when it stretched endlessly without interruption. At first, I found myself overwhelmed by small inconveniences. Things I'd taken for granted at home now required effort: figuring out the quirks of my ancient stove, organizing my groceries, paying bills on time. Even laundry became an ordeal, the small stack of quarters on my dresser shrinking with every cycle. I missed the simplicity of home, where things just worked, as if by magic. Now, each task felt like a mountain, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to climb it alone. One morning, after a week of sleepless nights and worry, I woke up to find myself completely, painfully alone. I lay there in my bed, listening to the hollow echo of my own breath in the quiet room, feeling the chill of the air that my thin blankets couldn't keep out. My first thought was to call my mother, to ask her how to fix the faucet, or maybe just to hear her voice. But I stopped myself. I had left that world behind. I reminded myself, and this was what I wanted: self-reliance, independence, a life free from old expectations. Instead, I forced myself to get up, to make coffee, to start my day. I cleaned every inch of my apartment that morning, partly out of a need to feel productive and partly to push away the creeping loneliness. As I scrubbed the floor and wiped down counters, I thought about all the times I'd cleaned back at home, each chore a way to make myself useful, to prove that I had a place there, even if it was a quiet one. But here, cleaning wasn't a bid for approval. It was just me, taking care of my own space, making it my own. Somehow, that realization made the work feel lighter. I felt a small glimmer of pride. This was my place, my life. I was in control. As the days passed, I learned to fill the silence with small rituals. I'd make myself a simple breakfast each morning, a routine I hadn't realized I'd missed. I'd spend time by the window, sipping my coffee slowly, watching people walk by, everyone going somewhere, living their own lives. In these quiet moments, I felt a strange connection to the world outside, alone but not lonely, just a part of a larger rhythm. I started setting small goals for myself: a new recipe to try, a walk through a different neighborhood, even an evening out at a local cafe to read. Each little accomplishment felt like a victory, like a tiny affirmation that I was capable of building a life here. Some days, my efforts paid off, and I'd come home feeling content, as if I'd proven to myself that I could make it. Other days, the solitude would creep back in, darker than before, pressing down like a heavy blanket, making me question everything again. It was in those low moments, when I felt like nothing I did could fill the empty spaces, that I'd think of my family. I wondered if they noticed my absence, if they missed my quiet presence or the things I did for them without even being asked. But every time I picked up my phone to call, I'd stop myself, my fingers hovering over the screen. I'd left for a reason, and I wanted to honor that decision. I wanted to see if I could stand on my own, even if it meant enduring this aching loneliness. One evening, after a particularly hard day at work, I came home to find that the faucet had finally given out completely. Water was dripping steadily onto the floor, each drop echoing through the silence like a reminder of everything I still hadn't figured out. I sat down on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and felt the weight of it all: the broken faucet, the endless responsibilities, the quiet that seemed to press in from every corner. It was the first time I'd cried since I moved out. It wasn't a dramatic, stormy breakdown, just a few quiet tears that fell slowly, each one a release of everything I'd been holding inside. I let myself feel the frustration, the loneliness, the fear that maybe I wasn't as strong as I'd thought. When the tears stopped, I took a shaky breath and wiped my face, feeling a strange sense of calm. I was alone, yes, but I was also free. Free to break down, to cry, to feel weak, to be vulnerable without anyone watching or judging. And that, I realized, was a kind of strength in itself. The next morning, I found a hardware store and bought a cheap wrench. I spent hours fiddling with the faucet, reading instructions online, watching tutorial videos on my phone. It was harder than I'd expected, and I nearly gave up more than once. But after a lot of trial and error, I managed to get the dripping under control. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was something. I stood back, hands covered in grease, my shirt stained with water, and felt a small spark of pride. I'd solved my first real problem on my own. It was a small victory, a tiny accomplishment, but it felt monumental to me. In that moment, I understood that this was what independence really meant, not grand, sweeping gestures or flawless execution, but a series of small steps, each one a reminder that I was capable, that I could do this. In the weeks that followed, I found myself growing more comfortable in my new life. I learned to cook simple meals, figuring out which groceries lasted the longest and how to make my limited ingredients stretch. I picked up a small bookshelf from a thrift store and filled it with my journals, my books, my memories. Slowly, my apartment began to feel like home. The silence, which had once felt oppressive, became a comfort. It was a space where I could hear my own thoughts, where I could exist without anyone's expectations weighing me down. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living on my own terms. There were still hard days, of course, moments when I'd lie in bed and wonder if I'd made a mistake, if I should have stayed, if I was meant to be the quiet, reliable one after all. But each time, I'd remind myself of the reasons I'd left, of the dreams I'd found in my journals, of the little girl who'd once wanted to be seen. And each time, I felt a little stronger, a little braver, a little more certain that this was the right path. I wasn't just surviving, I was growing, changing, becoming someone new, and for the first time in my life, I felt like that was enough. As I settled into my routines, learning to live with the quiet and growing into my newfound independence, my family still lingered in the back of my mind. I tried not to think about him too much. After all, part of leaving was to create distance, to stop feeling like I had to carry everyone else's expectations. But, inevitably, they found ways of slipping back into my life, pulling at the threads of my thoughts like ghosts refusing to leave. It started with little things, occasional updates I saw on social media or heard through a mutual friend. Small changes, nothing major. But then, one evening as I was scrolling online, I noticed a strange post from my brother. He never posted much, but there it was, a vague message about things being different lately, and holding it together. At first, I brushed it off as him being dramatic, but something about his words nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that things back home were beginning to unravel. I called him that night, trying to sound casual, just checking in. It was odd talking to him without the buffer of everyone else in the background. Our conversations had always been shallow, light-hearted banter or meaningless updates. But now there was a tension I hadn't felt before. He told me he was busy with work, that things were fine at home, but his tone was strained. I knew he was holding back. After that call, a familiar ache settled in my chest, that quiet sense of responsibility I'd spent my whole life trying to outgrow. Part of me wanted to drive back, to ask questions, to dig into the things left unsaid, but I resisted. I had left for a reason. I couldn't just run back at the first sign of trouble. Couldn't let myself get pulled back into the same old role. I reminded myself of the promises I'd made here in my new apartment, the life I was trying to build. I couldn't let go of all that just because of a few cryptic words. In the days that followed, I learned more. One night, my mother left me a voicemail. She sounded tired, older somehow, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. She mentioned my father, his business going through a rough patch, some things about bills piling up and tension with my siblings. It was subtle, almost like she hadn't meant to say it, but the words slipped out, giving me a glimpse into the cracks I hadn't noticed before. For a moment, I felt a surge of guilt. Here I was, carving out my own little life, while they were struggling back home. I wondered if my absence had made things worse, if my decision to leave had somehow shifted more responsibilities onto everyone else. But then I reminded myself that this was the same family that had barely noticed when I left, that had always viewed me as the reliable one, the quiet helper who didn't ask for much. My leaving hadn't caused their problems, it had only revealed them. Still, a small part of me felt compelled to reach out. I called my mother one afternoon, asking how things were going. She tried to brush it off, assuring me that everything was fine, but there was a strain in her voice, an edge of exhaustion that made me pause. I could hear my siblings in the background, voices raised, frustration simmering just below the surface. It was like listening to an echo of everything I'd left behind, a reminder of why I'd chosen to leave. After we hung up, I sat there, feeling conflicted. I realized that, in a way, I was still tied to them, still part of the invisible machinery that held the family together. But this time, I wasn't there to smooth things over, to absorb the tension like I'd always done. And maybe, I thought, that was part of the problem. My absence had created a space they weren't used to, a gap that forced them to face their own issues instead of leaning on me to fill it. Over the next few weeks, I watched from a distance as things continued to change back home. My siblings' posts grew less frequent, more cryptic, hinting at frustrations and conflicts I could only guess at. I found myself piecing together the fragments, imagining the arguments, the tense conversations, the shifting dynamics. I could picture my parents' strained expressions, my siblings' resentment bubbling to the surface, all of it playing out like some distant drama. But for the first time, I wasn't a character in that story. I was just a witness, an observer, detached and separate, and though there was a sadness to it, a lingering guilt, there was also a sense of relief. I didn't have to carry it anymore. I didn't have to be the one smoothing things over, the one absorbing everyone's frustrations. They were finally dealing with it themselves. Then came a call from my mother one evening, her voice shaking. She told me that my father had been to the hospital, a minor health scare that had everyone on edge. She didn't go into detail, just that he was fine now, but that things were tense. For a brief moment, I felt that old urge, the one that made me want to drive back, to step in, to fix things, but I held back, taking a deep breath. I told her I was glad he was okay, that I hoped things would settle down, but I didn't offer to come back. I didn't slip back into the comforting role of caretaker. Instead, I asked how she was holding up. A simple question, but one I'd never thought to ask before. She paused, as if caught off guard, and then told me things had been hard, that she'd been doing her best to keep everyone calm, to hold things together. In her voice, I heard an echo of myself, the part of me that had always tried to keep the peace, to make things easier for everyone else. And for the first time, I understood her in a way I hadn't before. She, too, had been playing a role, one she'd inherited, perhaps, from her own mother, and one she'd unconsciously passed down to me. She had become the quiet stabilizer, the one who held things together, who sacrificed her own needs for the sake of harmony. And I, in my own way, had been doing the same. When we hung up, I felt a mix of emotions: empathy, sadness, and a quiet, newfound resolve. I realized that breaking free from my family didn't mean abandoning them. It meant understanding where I came from, seeing the patterns and the roles that had shaped me, and choosing a different path. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on my family with a new perspective. I didn't feel the same resentment. Instead, there was a growing sense of compassion. I saw them not as people who had failed me, but as people who were struggling, just like I was, to find their way in the world. My father, burdened by the weight of his business. My mother, caught between roles she'd never asked for. My siblings, each grappling with their own insecurities and frustrations. And me, I was part of that story. But I was also separate, free to build something different, to live a life not bound by those same expectations. I felt a strange peace, a quiet acceptance of my family for who they were: imperfect, struggling, yet still my family. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a sense of closure, as if a door had quietly shut on that chapter of my life. I wasn't running from them anymore. I was simply choosing my own path. One that was shaped not by resentment or disappointment, but by love for myself. And, in a way, for them too. The call came late on a Thursday evening. My mother's voice trembled, words spilling out in a rushed, choked up way that immediately set off alarms. She told me my father had been readmitted to the hospital. This time, it wasn't just a scare. It was serious. The doctors were concerned, and the details she shared: blood pressure, heart murmurs, terms I didn't fully understand, were enough to fill me with a wave of dread. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process her words. She didn't ask me to come home, but I could hear the quiet plea in her voice. This time, I didn't hesitate. I agreed to make the trip, to be there as soon as I could. For the first time since I'd left, I felt a sense of duty pulling me back, a tug I couldn't ignore. The drive back was surreal, the roads familiar yet strange, as if I was seeing them through a new lens. Memories flooded my mind: the countless drives I'd made through these streets, the countless times I'd come home, slipping into the role of the quiet helper, the one who absorbed everyone's tension without complaint. But this time, things were different. I was different. As I pulled up to my family's house, I could feel my heart pounding, an uneasy mix of nerves and old, familiar resentment. The house looked the same, but I knew, just as I had changed, the dynamics within had shifted in my absence. I wasn't sure what to expect. Inside, the air was thick with tension. My mother greeted me with a tired, grateful smile, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. My siblings were scattered around the living room, each lost in their own thoughts. The silence was palpable, a kind of uneasy truce holding everyone together. My father was still at the hospital, and though he was stable, no one was sure what the coming days would bring. Seeing my family this way, vulnerable and uncertain, stirred something in me. I'd always thought of them as unbreakable, as people who didn't need me in any meaningful way. But here they were, brittle and fragile, holding on to each other in their own silent way. I suddenly felt like an outsider, a stranger in a place I'd once called home. The days that followed were filled with hospital visits, whispered conversations, and a constant sense of waiting. I stayed in my old room, the walls still lined with remnants of my former life. Every night, I'd lie awake, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on me, memories resurfacing with a sharp clarity that was both painful and strangely comforting. I realized I'd carried so much of this weight with me, even as I tried to leave it behind. Being here forced me to confront it, to face the ways in which my family's expectations had shaped me. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea in silence. She looked tired, worn down, her face lined with worry. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "It's been different since you left," she said, her eyes focused on her cup. "I didn't realize how much you did around here, how much we relied on you." Her words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that felt heavier than any apology. For years, I'd been the silent anchor, the one who held everything together without complaint. And now, in my absence, they'd felt the weight of what I'd left behind. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, letting her words settle between us. Part of me wanted to tell her about the hurt I'd carried. The years of feeling unseen, the countless birthdays that had left me feeling unworthy. But I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet pain she carried, and I realized that maybe she had her own regrets, her own unspoken burdens. In that moment, I felt a shift, a quiet understanding that maybe we were both just products of a cycle, each of us doing our best to navigate a legacy of expectations and silent sacrifices. Over the next few days, I noticed how my siblings interacted with each other, each one trying, in their own way, to fill the roles they thought were expected of them. My brother, usually carefree, took on a serious tone, trying to manage finances and keep things organized. My sister, usually independent and detached, hovered close to my mother, offering quiet support. They were all struggling to adjust, to figure out how to function without me there to hold everything together. I realized, in a strange way, that my absence had forced them to confront their own responsibilities, to step into roles they'd never had to play. And though it was painful to watch, there was a part of me that felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of validation. My decision to leave had given them the space to grow, to face the reality of our family's dynamics without me there to soften the edges. On my last day at home, I visited my father in the hospital. He was weak, his voice softer than I remembered, but there was a clarity in his eyes, a kind of resignation that felt like acceptance. He looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and regret, and though he didn't say much, I could feel the weight of what he wanted to convey. Perhaps he, too, understood that my leaving had been necessary, that it was a step toward breaking the quiet patterns we'd all been trapped in. As I packed my things to leave, my mother hugged me tightly, holding on a little longer than usual. I felt a quiet sense of closure, a sense that, in my absence, my family had finally started to see me for who I was, not just the quiet, dependable one, but someone with her own dreams, her own life. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I knew that leaving again wouldn't be easy, that the pull of family would always be there, quietly lingering, but this time, I felt lighter, freer. I was no longer running from my past, I was embracing it, understanding it, and choosing my own path in spite of it. As the familiar road stretched out before me, I felt a new sense of purpose, a quiet strength that had been born in the spaces between love and resentment, duty and independence. I wasn't just leaving home, I was leaving behind the weight of old expectations, the silent sacrifices that had defined me for so long. And for the first time, I felt ready to step into the life I'd chosen, not out of necessity or rebellion, but out of love for myself. And, in a way, love for my family too. Returning to my apartment felt different this time. The quiet that had once pressed down on me now felt like a familiar companion, a presence that reflected my own newfound peace. The space hadn't changed, my few pieces of furniture were still neatly arranged, the empty walls still bare, but somehow, it felt more like home. I took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of being back. This was my place, a space I had chosen, shaped, and filled with only what I needed. I had left my family with a clearer understanding of who I was and why I had chosen this path. And now, I felt ready to pour myself into the life I'd envisioned. No longer running, no longer searching for anyone else's approval. I was here to live for myself. The first few days back were filled with a kind of quiet exhilaration. I made lists, set goals, thought about the kind of person I wanted to become. Small things at first, steps I knew I could manage. I signed up for a local cooking class, determined to learn how to make more than just the basic meals I'd been surviving on. I'd always been drawn to the idea of cooking for myself, of making meals that felt nourishing, both for the body and the soul. There was something empowering about the act, a reminder that I could take care of myself in ways I hadn't allowed myself to before. The class was a small, intimate group, mostly people looking to improve their cooking skills or try something new. I found myself laughing, enjoying the simple pleasure of learning alongside others, of creating something with my own hands. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of community, a connection to others that wasn't built on obligation or expectation, but on shared curiosity and joy. As the weeks went by, I added other small rituals to my life. I'd take evening walks around the neighborhood, savoring the crisp air and the way the world seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sometimes, I'd pass by bustling cafes and hear the laughter and chatter spilling out into the streets. A reminder that life was full of possibility, full of people living their own stories, just as I was learning to live mine. I found a used bookshelf at a second-hand store one weekend, a little worn around the edges but sturdy. I brought it home, feeling a quiet thrill as I carefully placed my books on its shelves. Arranging my journals in a neat row, each one held pieces of my story, fragments of the journey that had brought me here. I'd once viewed them as evidence of a life defined by limitations. But now, they felt like markers of resilience, reminders of the strength I'd discovered in myself along the way. I made it a habit to write in a new journal, recording the details of my days, my thoughts, my small victories. I found solace in those pages, a place where I could lay down my dreams without fear or hesitation. Writing became a way of grounding myself, of reconnecting with the person I was becoming. Work was another area where I noticed a change. I'd always done my job well, fulfilling each task with a quiet efficiency, never drawing attention to myself. But now, I felt a new sense of purpose. I started volunteering for projects that interested me, speaking up in meetings, sharing ideas I'd once kept to myself. I began to see my job not just as a means to an end, but as an opportunity to challenge myself, to grow, to contribute in ways that felt meaningful. At first, it felt strange, almost like stepping into someone else's life. But gradually, I noticed how my colleagues responded, the way they'd listen when I spoke, the way they'd seek out my input. It was a small shift, but it felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the value I brought not just as an employee, but as a person with ideas, strengths, and goals of my own. Each day, I found myself growing more comfortable in this new version of myself. The quiet, dependable girl I'd once been was still there, but she was no longer defined by the expectations of others. She was stronger now, bolder, someone who had learned to stand on her own, not out of necessity, but out of choice. One evening, as I was going through my mail, I noticed an envelope from my parents. I opened it carefully, half expecting some formal message or perhaps a brief note about my father's health. Instead, I found a short letter in my mother's neat handwriting. She wrote about the family, small updates and well wishes, but there was something else in her words, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had been left unsaid between us. She mentioned how my father was recovering, how they were managing, and then, at the end, she added a line that stopped me in my tracks: "We're proud of you." I read those words over and over, feeling a swell of emotions I couldn't quite name. It was a simple sentiment, but it carried the weight of years, of all the birthdays and quiet sacrifices, of the roles we'd each played in silence. In those 4 words, I felt a kind of closure, a release of the resentment I'd carried for so long. For the first time, I felt seen not as the quiet helper, but as the person I'd chosen to become. I placed the letter in my journal, pressing it between the pages like a bookmark in my story. It wasn't the grand gesture I'd once dreamed of, but it was enough, a quiet acknowledgement, a gentle affirmation that, in their own way, they understood. In the months that followed, I continued to build my life piece by piece. Each small victory felt like a chapter in a story I was writing for myself. A story not defined by my family or their expectations, but by the choices I made, the risks I took, and the dreams I dared to follow. I began to think about things I'd once pushed aside: travel, new experiences, goals I'd deemed too ambitious. Slowly, I allowed myself to dream again, to believe that I could create a life that felt full, whole, and entirely my own. The loneliness I'd once feared had become a quiet strength, a reminder of the resilience I'd found in solitude. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving, growing, discovering a world of possibility that lay beyond the confines of my family's expectations. One day, I walked past a shop window and caught a glimpse of my reflection. I paused, studying the woman who looked back at me. She was still familiar, still carrying pieces of the girl I'd been, but there was something different in her gaze. A quiet confidence, a sense of purpose. I realized then that I'd become someone I could be proud of. Someone who had learned to find her own worth, her own voice. As I walked away, I felt a surge of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. For the struggles, the sacrifices, the lessons learned. My family was still part of me, still woven into the fabric of who I was, but they no longer defined me. I was free to be myself, to live a life of my own choosing, a life that felt full and rich in ways I hadn't even dreamed of. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet, steady contentment that ran deeper than anything I'd known. I was ready to move forward, to embrace the unknown, confident in my own strength, my own worth. I didn't need validation or approval. I had found something far more precious: self-acceptance, self-love, and the courage to keep writing my story, one page at a time. One chilly autumn afternoon, as I returned from work, I found a package waiting outside my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anything, so I picked it up curiously, feeling the weight of the small box in my hands. There was no return address, but the familiar handwriting on the label made my heart skip. It was from my family. I carried the package inside, setting it down on my kitchen table, staring at it for a moment. I hadn't heard much from them since my father's recovery, just the occasional text from my mother. Small updates that felt like a gentle check-in rather than any plea to come back. I hadn't expected anything from them, certainly not a package. Part of me hesitated, uncertain of what I'd find inside. This small, nondescript box felt like it held the weight of years, a quiet offering from a family who rarely expressed emotions openly. I took a deep breath, then carefully peeled away the tape, lifting the lid with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. Inside, I found a handwritten note from my mother. She'd always had a precise, elegant handwriting, the letters flowing gracefully across the page. I picked up the note, my eyes scanning the words, reading slowly. We wanted to send you something special this year. I know it's small, but we thought of you. You've always been strong, even when we didn't notice it. We're proud of who you are, proud of the life you're building. This is just a small reminder that we see you. Beneath the note, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a small, delicate necklace, a simple pendant, a polished silver circle. Unadorned, pure in its simplicity. It wasn't extravagant or flashy, just a small, understated piece that felt like something I would have chosen for myself. I held it in my hand, feeling the cool weight of the metal, letting the meaning behind the gift settle into my heart. This wasn't a token of pity or guilt, it was a quiet acknowledgement. A gesture that said, we see you, we respect you, and we love you. In that moment, I felt a rush of emotions: gratitude, relief, a warmth that spread through me, softening the edges of old hurts. I had spent so many years feeling unseen, undervalued, and here was something small but profound, a recognition of the journey I'd undertaken and the person I'd become. I put on the necklace, feeling its gentle weight rest against my collarbone, a subtle but constant reminder of my family and the journey we'd all been on. I glanced at myself in the mirror, noticing the way the pendant caught the light. Simple yet striking, it felt like a symbol of everything I'd worked for: the quiet resilience, the strength I'd found in solitude, the peace I'd made with my past. As the days went on, I wore the necklace everywhere. It became a part of me, a reminder that I didn't need grand gestures or extravagant gifts to feel valued. I had spent so much of my life waiting for validation, for a sign that I mattered, and here it was: a small, simple token, a reminder that sometimes the quietest affirmations hold the deepest meaning. Over time, my relationship with my family began to take on a new shape. I didn't need to go back. They didn't need me to play the role I'd always played. Instead, we found a quiet, respectful distance, a connection that allowed each of us to grow independently. I started to feel comfortable calling my mother, sharing small details of my life, and she did the same, telling me about the small changes at home, how my siblings were stepping up, filling the roles I'd once held. Each call, each message felt like a small bridge, a connection built on mutual respect rather than expectation. I no longer felt like the quiet helper or the overlooked child. I was simply me, valued for who I was, not for what I did or didn't do. My father's health continued to improve, and my mother found ways to lean on my siblings, who were slowly learning to shoulder their own responsibilities. I could feel the shift in our family, a gentle rebalancing, as though my departure had allowed us all to step back and reassess our roles. It was subtle, but it felt real, a quiet evolution that brought us closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. One evening, as I sat by my window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance, I thought about the person I had become. I thought about the years of quiet sacrifice, the silent longing for recognition, the struggle to find my own worth. I realized, in that moment, that I had given myself the greatest gift of all, the courage to leave. The strength to build a life on my own terms. The necklace felt warm against my skin, a gentle reminder that I didn't need to seek validation from anyone else. I had found it within myself, in the quiet resilience that had carried me through loneliness and doubt, in the simple rituals that filled my days with purpose, in the small victories that reminded me of my strength. As I sat there, I felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet contentment that settled into my bones. I had come full circle, finding my way back to myself, not through anyone else's approval, but through my own. I was enough. I had always been enough. And as the city lights flickered softly in the night, I felt ready to move forward, to keep building the life I'd dreamed of, not out of rebellion or resentment, but out of love for myself, for my family, and for the journey that had brought me here. In that moment, I knew that I was home. Time has a way of softening the edges of memory, of turning pain into wisdom and bitterness into gratitude. As the months passed, I found myself revisiting the story of my life with a new perspective, each chapter feeling more like a lesson learned than a wound reopened. Looking back, I could see all the threads that had woven together to create the person I'd become. I thought of every quiet birthday, every unassuming gift, every overlooked moment that had once made me feel small. I had spent so much time yearning for someone to recognize me, to see the person I was beneath the quiet, practical facade. But in the end, it was through those same overlooked moments that I'd found myself. I'd learned that my worth didn't need validation, that my value wasn't measured by the gifts I received or the roles I played. Each experience, each moment of solitude and struggle, had led me here, to a life that felt authentic and whole. I had built something that was entirely mine, a life that reflected my choices, my strength, my resilience. And though it hadn't been easy, though there were days of loneliness and doubt, I could now look at myself in the mirror and feel a quiet pride. I had learned to value my own company, to find fulfillment in my own accomplishments, no matter how small. As winter approached, I found myself feeling reflective, turning inward as the world outside grew colder and quieter. I spent evenings curled up with my journals, reading through the pages that documented my journey, each entry a testament to the growth I'd achieved, the obstacles I'd overcome. One evening, I came across an entry from years ago, written in my familiar handwriting, but with a voice that felt younger, more uncertain. I had written about my dreams, the things I wanted to achieve, the places I wanted to go. And there, in my own words, I'd captured a vision of a life that felt full and rich. A life where I was seen, valued, and loved. Reading those words, I felt a surge of emotion, a mix of nostalgia and pride. I realized that, in many ways, I was already living that life. I had become someone who didn't wait for others to see her worth. I had learned to see it in myself. I had built a life that felt meaningful, filled with purpose and joy, shaped by my own hands. In the following weeks, I started making plans for the future. I began setting new goals, not because I felt any need to prove myself, but because I wanted to continue growing, to keep exploring all the possibilities that lay before me. I enrolled in a class to learn a new skill, something I'd always wanted to try but had never had the courage to pursue. I made plans to travel, to visit places I'd only dreamed of, knowing that I was fully capable of navigating the world on my own. There was a quiet thrill in these plans, a sense of excitement and possibility that filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. I no longer felt like I was waiting for life to begin, I was living it. Fully and freely, each day a new chapter in the story I was creating. One night, as I sat by my window watching the snowfall gently coat the world outside, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The city lights glowed softly in the distance, each one a reminder of the countless lives being lived, each one unique, filled with its own challenges and triumphs. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for my family, for my journey, for the quiet resilience that had carried me through. I thought of my parents, my siblings, and all the roles we'd played in each other's lives, the unspoken expectations and the quiet sacrifices. I no longer held resentment for the way things had been. Instead, I felt a quiet compassion, a recognition of the ways in which we'd all done our best. Even when we'd fallen short, I knew that I'd always be connected to them, that the threads of family would always be part of me. But I was no longer defined by them. I was free to live my own life, to forge my own path, to continue becoming the person I'd always dreamed of being. As the snow continued to fall, I reached for my journal. Turning to a blank page, I started to write, capturing the thoughts that filled my mind, the hope and excitement I felt for the future. I wrote about the dreams I still held, the plans I'd made, the life I wanted to create. Each word felt like a promise to myself, a commitment to keep moving forward, to keep growing, to keep embracing the world with open arms. When I finished, I closed the journal, a sense of contentment settling over me. I knew that life would always have its challenges, that there would be days of doubt and struggle, but I also knew that I had the strength to face them. I had found my place in the world, not through anyone else's approval, but through my own journey, my own resilience. And in that quiet moment, with the world wrapped in a blanket of snow, I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. I was home not in any one place, but in myself, in the life I'd built, in the person I'd become. I was ready to move forward, to continue the story I'd started, knowing that I was enough, that I had always been enough. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to look back. I was free to step into the future, to embrace whatever lay ahead with hope and courage. I was ready,